All right, episode 14 of the SumerSports show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by the CEO of SumerSports, Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, we're a little bit, under kind of the gun a little bit. Even like the second computer I got over here, kind of funny there. I'm in Minnesota right now. I'm actually in the house that I grew up in. My parents still live here, which is kind of cool. We moved here when I was 6 years old, and they still live here in a town called Maplewood, Minnesota. And you're in Colorado, just getting off the slopes here a little bit, Thomas. How like Christmas? What was Christmas like when you were a general manager, and now what is it now that you're what we call a civilian?
That's a great point. It was almost non-existent. We had a few hours here and there to spend time with the children, of course, and your family, but you were always working. So this is, for me to be out here a few days before Christmas. As I mentioned, I drove out here, met my family out here. We spent 3 days here, all the while still working. And you know that. You're very aware of how we do that. You work some hours here and there. You get a couple hours being up there, and I was in the lodge looking over my daughter, watching her. And then all of a sudden I'm back online. We did 3 or 4, interestingly enough, some, end of year reviews in between all of this. So my point is I'm enjoying my time here, but it's not ever off. And I was funny because I've talked to a number of people in our business who, they're taking legitimate time off. They have 4 or 5 days off, and we just have never done that in professional football. So I told Jack, our COO and even PTJ, our owner, Paul Tudor Jones, I'm like, you can call me anytime I'm available. If we need to talk about anything, that's just kind of the way it is, unfortunately, in the football world.
Well, but fortunately too, right? I mean, for us, it is hard. And I'm like this, right? So this is the first time, I haven't been to my wife's family's Christmas for 3 years now. Part of it was COVID related. Like the first flight I took after COVID-19 happened was Christmas Eve to go visit my parents. But when I was at Pro Football Focus, we did a live pregame show every Sunday, and I was on that show. We did a college football show, and I was on that show. And so, the last 3 Christmases, I've slept at the PFF offices the night before I flew. Because, people don't know Cincinnati. It's I live kind of out closer to Dayton than I do the airport. And then the airport's in, northern Kentucky. So, I would get done with the show. It would be a Sunday. You get done with the show. You get done with Sunday Night Football. We'd help Collinsworth with that. And then, we'd start our post-game show, our post-week show at midnight. And then I get done at 1. Then I'd have to, and then for me, it'd be a drive, an hour home, and then an hour back to the airport, 3 hours later. So I used to just sleep at the office and then, take an Uber to the airport and come back and but you have to be back before the next show or whatever, and in your case, the next game. And so this will be I think my wife's family thought I hated them for a few years there because I didn't have the capacity to go visit them. So it'll be nice. I was planning on coming to Minnesota tomorrow, but because of this snowstorm that we're all dealing with, we decided to go last night. And so today's been a little bit droopy for me just because I didn't get enough sleep. But it's cool now that I think that, we love football so much that it's hard to get away, especially during the season. And it's hard to sort of compartmentalize, it's football season, but I'm going to take a couple days off and not think about it so much. Because in your world, right, you had most of, was it July off when you were in NFL, when you were a general manager or a scout, right? That was the time when everybody in the NFL took time off.
Yes, exactly. I cannot believe that my daughter is running in front of the window, and I can see her reflection. Sorry, it's messing me up. So what I would say to you, interestingly enough, is I just want to add this too, because the whole Christmas time, I want to add this. This is really interesting, and this is I've always believed in the X game line. I'm just bringing up Colorado for a minute. It was go big or go home, right? I used to say that to our guys, whether we're making trades, making moves, and it wasn't trying to be cool, to use a X game lingo, but it's my most passionate sport in the world. As much as I love biking, by the way, I love snowboarding just that much more. Do you know that the Minnesota people are some of the best jibbers. Do you know what a jibber is?
No, I don't know that.
In Minnesota, of course, you don't have the big mountains to be flying down and the trees and the glades to be working with. You need to figure out how to jib, and jibbing is riding rails and boxes, and it's kind of just, that's how you make up your time in Minnesota. And some of the best jibbers in snowboarding are from Minnesota and Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. The only reason I bring that in is because all of my life leading up to this, when I wasn't a GM, I was able to get out on the mountains and enjoy my passion. GM, I really took a break on that. And now that I'm back in it, it fuels me, which it's something that's really important to me. And it makes me feel like I'm around the Christmas spirit, which I know you're going to try to segue into eating food in Christmas as well, because we were talking about getting really personal during this time. So throw right back at you. I just wanted to let you know that.
Well, and I could tell that, right? Like, you even when you were a general manager, but especially after you left the Falcons, like, you did a bunch. You were on my podcast before, and you were, we asked you to give a recommendation, and you had the book Essentialism, which was I thought like a very thoughtful kind of like answer that maybe not a lot of people would give. And even when you and I were getting to know each other, like a lot of our discussions about football, you were in the van traveling to Boulder, like these things, like you were really trying to recapture, some of your passions and stuff. And like, what I think is cool about Sumer is obviously like, we're all, fairly, I think, receptive to people having, their own, and I think both, I'm more on the junkie side of this spectrum, where like, I took a nap today, but like on in the background was a football game from like 20 years ago. And like, you're also a big, football guy, but you are able to sort of, rewind from that a little bit. And what I like is like, of course, like, it's sort of a healthier experience here on this side, I think, relative at times to on that side now.
But Eric, the junkie side, I mean, from the day I was born, I've been around football because my dad was a coach. From literally as I, came into this world, I was around football. So I think maybe that, that junkie side of me, it's still very ingrained. But I think over the years, I realized I needed another element, or I just would have been so myopically formed as an adult. So some of these things that I do, I think it's important. I think it's important for anyone in this business.
For sure. So here's a question that I have, because we'll get into the football here. What I've noticed, like, I'm just gonna on-air production meeting for all of the people that are watching currently. It takes a little bit of time for the maximum number of listeners to come on live. So I told Thomas off air, I'm like, let's build this thing up a little bit. Let's get a bunch of listeners with us before we really start getting the nuts and bolts of what they came here for, which is football. When it comes to Christmas, what is your favorite dish on Christmas? For me, it has to be, I'm a really big fan of the mashed potatoes. I'm a really big fan of the ham. But at the same time, Christmas is like, what do you think? Underrated or overrated food time?
No, I think it might be underrated. I think it's a time to splurge for all of us. And you probably know this, maybe our listeners don't. I mean, I eat a pescatarian diet, so I'm not partaking in the bird as much as I am. We'll make usually an extra really good salmon. I will have the mashed potatoes and all the sides, and I love my cranberries. And I'm a sweet tooth person as much as I want to get that in control. I love my chocolate, of course. So, but it's usually more decadent during the Christmas time for me because I feel like I can get away with it. What about you? Do you think it's over or underrated?
I think it's a little overrated, just because I think that I'm like a lot like you, where my preference for food is much more towards fish and much more towards salads and stuff like that, especially over the past few years where I've really tried to take better care of myself. And like, so I always find myself for Thanksgiving and Christmas just like always regretting what I end up eating. And so I remember one year my mom made tacos and they were just amazing. And I'm just like, why can't we do this like every single year? This seems like the way to go. And I do know that, I don't know if you know this story about me, but like when it comes to holidays, like I'm very unconventional. Last year for Thanksgiving, I had chicken tikka masala for Thanksgiving. And that that hits the spot for me sort of like every time. By the way, good question here from Dean, who has been a loyal listener to the show. You can comment on the show if you are in the YouTube. Surprise episode, ? I thought that there were one per week. Great news. Dean, we are doing Monday and Wednesday episodes now. And the Monday episode is going to be discussions of a player evaluation for right now. Thomas and I have already gone through edge and interior defensive linemen. I do want to do another on-air production meeting with Thomas right now. Should we do linebackers Monday? What position would you like to do Monday so that we can prepare for that? But yeah, we are doing 2 episodes a week. So hopefully, twice the fun for all of our loyal listeners here. Thomas, what do you think about linebackers Monday?
I love the idea of linebackers. I'm a linebacker. We are always trying to find the marquee linebacker. As I mentioned the other day, you want a leader in the front line, you want a leader in the middle, and that middle linebacker, that inside backer, man, sets such a tone. We thought we had one in Sean Witherspoon. Unfortunately, he had some injuries for us back in the day just to use that. We literally thought we had the stud to build with for years and years. It's not an easy spot, but when you get them, it's amazing. I can't wait to talk about them. Yeah,
Sam says cornerback. We'll get to cornerback. And your specialty when you were a scout was the defensive backfield. So I'm really excited to do defensive back with you because it's going to be mostly me listening as opposed to talking. I do have some cool stuff. I am going to bring graphics onto the show next week if we do linebacker, which I'm really excited about. One of my former interns and good friends, Tej Seth, and I wrote a paper about linebackers that we're getting published here relatively soon using tracking data. So it'll be a cool episode. But what I want to talk about, Thomas, and now that we've gotten going here a little bit, you talked at the very end the other day about head coaches on Monday's show and what head coaches are worth, right? And again, we don't want to dehumanize this. Like, we know that there are humans involved in here, but I do think that there's a really cool question about if you do get an elite head coach, or an elite head coach exists. So let's just throw a name out there. Sean Payton, right? Former New Orleans Saints coach, turned a franchise around, won a Super Bowl, had a second stint as well. Kind of your nemesis as well. You being a Falcon, him being a Saint. I want to get down to the idea of like, okay, if this guy is semi-available, how much would you as a general manager trade for a coach of that of the elite caliber, the Hall of Fame caliber guy? What would be the right price? And I think I have a decent answer, but I want to see us kind of iterate on this, both from a qualitative and somebody who's been there before. You hired Dan Quinn. Dan Quinn helped you take the Falcons to a Super Bowl. Clearly a good hire. I've never hired a coach before, but I've helped people hire coaches. What would you like? Just ballpark. What would you think like a decent starting point for a price would be?
I think when you're talking about the top 2 or 3 in the league, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. Let's say and I don't mean there's a lot of good coaches in the league, but let's think about like Shanahan. Let's think about obviously Belichick,
Sean McVay.
Yeah, even like, I'm going to be honest with you, I even put Nick Sirianni to a certain extent in that category. I think he's more in that LaFleur tier where that's a very good coach. I'm not going to give him his gold jacket yet, but like guys like that where I'm like, that guy's done a pretty damn good job of elevating a franchise. So like, kind of let's think about maybe a step above the LaFleurs and Siriannis. But maybe not necessarily like Belichick. He's a little older, but like kind of that quality of coach. Like, what would we have to pay for, to get this person into the building?
Look, I think those are 2 first rounders plus. And I mean, it's interesting you say that because this was presented to me, when again, and I've said this time and again, I really loved, and he was a 3-time coach of the year, Mike Smith. And I think Dan Quinn is a damn good coach, and he should get another shot at it. When we were going through what we were going through the last, year and a little bit, and after when I started thinking, okay, maybe Arthur Blank is going to keep me around and I'm going to be able to revisit the idea of bringing in a 3rd head coach, didn't know which direction we were going to go, of course. I had started thinking more than ever after going through 2 coaches who were really good, but we didn't accomplish, unfortunately, what we wanted, which was not just the coaching. It was me. It was all of us. I was so much more open-minded to think, hey, let's talk about getting the top coach in the league, in an organization, and let's see how much it's truly worth. Because you can go round and round in our league, Eric, and GMs will argue it's the quarterback. GMs will argue it's the coach. That whole banter, the whole, especially when you're talking about what was going on in New England with Bill and Tom. Remember, I think I told you before, I don't know if it was on this pod, but when I had Jason Light on my travel around my GM journey pod, he literally said, though he thinks it was a huge sort of like killer move that he brought in Tom Brady, his biggest air quote baller move was bringing in the head coach. Think about that comment. That is a strong comment from a person who has a really strong belief in the league. And whether you like Jason and what he's done or not, he was a Super Bowl champion. And he said in the very end, it was more about Bruce Arians at that time, not minimizing Tom Brady. That's a big question. So to bring this back around very quickly, when you're a GM and you're searching over years and years, especially when you get into double digits, as much as you like the coaches you've had, you start thinking big picture and you're like, would I give away 2 first-round picks for Sean Payton, McVay, whoever else is deemed as it? And you do think a lot more about that, believe me.
Yeah, well, and I like Todd Bowles. I certainly think that he's a good football coach, and especially as a defensive coordinator, his game plan against Kansas City in the 2020 Super Bowl is legendary. But given how Tampa Bay has done this year without Bruce Arians at the helm, you could make that argument. Like, there's a good argument to make because Brady is a constant there. He's gotten older, right? And we know how age curves go, even for somebody like Brady. But, going from Arians to Bowles was considered a lateral move in the offseason, and it's been anything but as far as the results have been concerned. And so maybe that's a little bit in Light's, repertoire, a positive data point there. Bowles, again, like I said, I think Bowles has, got the short end of the stick in New York. But, so far, like, this is a good roster and they're struggling a little bit. So maybe there was a lot that Arians was adding that we didn't appreciate in real time. I think that's a really good point. Like, let me hit you with a little bit of math here, though. I'm gonna try to math this up because I pointed out that Nick Sirianni this year, when you look at 4th down decisions, 2-point conversion decisions, avoiding timeouts, and avoiding delay of game penalties. Now, some of it's correlated with who your quarterback is and stuff like that, but for the most part, these are just levers the coach can pull in game. Nick Sirianni's been worth about 2/3 of a win over the average NFL coach. Now, that's a lot. Like, if you think about non-quarterbacks, it's got to be a guy like Aaron Donald. It's got to be a guy like Justin Jefferson. It's got to be Trent Williams in his prime. Those are the only non-quarterbacks that can even touch that win share number during a season, right? So, and that's just on whether or not he's pushing the right levers in that. Like, we both know that there's more that goes into coaching, substitutions, player development, all that stuff. So if you can, let's say, conservatively, the best head coach is worth even more, like 2 or 3 times that much, adding to, just like orders of magnitude. So let's say the best head coach is worth about, 1.25 wins per year reliably, over expected, right? So you grade that out everywhere, right? Over the course of a 5-year contract, given a $208 million salary cap, that number is about $150 million, like, added in on-field value, right? And it's probably a little bit more, by the way, because our numbers for players like Tom Brady's adding $50 million on the field last year. He's worth 5 wins above replacement, all that kind of stuff. But it's more than that because the league only can spend 208 per team, right? So, you are uncapped, morally, I guess, with a coach as far as what you want to spend on them. If you take a $10 million salary per year for a coach, which I think it seems kind of whatever, that's $50 million then. So you got $100 million left. $100 million is about what 2 first-round picks end up giving you in value of surplus during the first 5 years of their deal. So what's really cool is your intuition was absolutely correct, right? So you get like 2 first-round picks plus the salary. Those are basically what you end up with a coach. And so I'm sort of thinking to myself, like, if Sean Payton's available, right? If or here's even a bigger thing, and I don't necessarily want to be all that confrontational here, but let's say you're a general manager and a guy like Mike Vrabel, or a coach who I think we've praised a lot on the show. Like, would there ever be a situation where you as a general manager would actively, kind of like the John Gruden thing, actively go after a coach that is employed by another team and go with a trade?
Again, 13 years in, 12 and a half, and being in a little bit of limbo now, obviously a lot of limbo because we don't know if GMs get their opportunities again. Categorically, yes. Hell yes, I would. And again, this is about making sure that you bring the best situation to the team you're going to be working for. And if that means what is, for the betterment of the team, and even though it might not be the happiest place for certain people, and you have to do what's best, I would look at everything. And I have not spent a lot of time looking on that side, only on the opposite end of all this, meaning after I got fired, did I really start considering, the opportunity to look into something like this. And it's a big time move. It takes a lot to consider that. I mean, there are people out there that talk about it within our circles, within general managers and former general managers. And a lot of people are back and forth on it. Yeah, I would do it, but do you know the repercussions it would have on your team, on your players, on your coaching staff moving forward when you're trying? Here's another thing for the listeners. When you're doing something like this as a GM and you think it's all about the betterment of the team, but you don't think of the repercussions about you trying to hire assistant coaches down the road after something like this happens, and they're like, Dimitroff or that GM, he's a pain in the ass. I would never go and work for him because indirectly he did this to our head coach. It's an amazing situation in the league, how much talk there is that way. And you do think that way. You don't want to, cut the bottom out or, blow the bottom out when you know how important it is to make sure that you really look at the repercussions.
Are there second order effects too? Like, if a coach has enough stature to warrant this move, does he have enough stature to challenge the general manager's authority in a lot of cases?
Yes.
Is that a risk that's tough? Because that's kind of where I'm at a little bit too at the quarterback position where, so let's take a step back for a sec. So the reason that Arians is no longer the coach for Tampa is that there was very clearly tension between he and Brady, right? And tension that ended up being creative and won him a Super Bowl, but ultimately that can wear on you, right?
Totally.
That is, if you're a powerful head coach and you bring in a powerful quarterback, then there's tension there and there's an issue. And so that might be why some guys, I think of Kyle Shanahan, one of the best, if not the best offensive innovators in the league, but he's always kind of preferred quarterbacks who were driving the car as opposed to quarterbacks who are the whole car, right? And because he's kind of one of the guys there. And Matt Ryan was an exception, but he also was not the head coach when that marriage happened. But when he's been in San Francisco, he's preferred the Kirk Cousins types, the Jimmy Garoppolo types, the Mac Jones, Trey Lance types. And so if you're a general manager, you have to almost be fairly well established to bring in a guy like that, because he could kneecap some of your power as an executive if he comes in with that price tag, right?
That's exactly right. Now, look, when I first got into this job, that many years ago, back in 2008, I remember thinking I really, really wanted the person that I could work with. I wanted the best relationship in the league, GM and head coach, because I really believed you could get a good head coach that had a really good idea of how he was going to run the team along with the general manager, and you were going to work together on everything, right? You weren't going to battle each other. And that was a big, big deal for us. So we did it with Mike Smith and then Dan Quinn as well. Very, very important to have two guys that I could work with. And yet I've had people in my ears over the years who are saying, Thomas, you have to get to a situation where you're comfortable. And if you banter every day, I've even had, and I won't mention the name, a really high respected executive who was convinced you need a contentious relationship with your head coach to ever win a Super Bowl. Vehemently opposed. I think that's completely asinine.
I've heard that too. And like when I was, and I'm going to give a shout out to Neil Hornsby, who's the former CEO of Pro Football Focus, a good friend of mine, started that company, was great. He called it creative tension. He liked to create creative tension at work. I hated that. I thought it was silly. There's enough things that cause tension that you have to manage. I never really understood creating it out of thin air just to, that was always something I disagreed with, but he certainly has experience where it did work. And I think in football, it can be even worse, right? Because we're ego driven people. And even I would say, one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten about this show from people in the league and also my friends in media is how, gracious you've been about being forward about your wins and losses. And I like to say that I'm the similar thing, but even then you and I think are fairly well-adjusted people for being in football. And you and I still have a little bit of dog in us as far as competitiveness. And do you really want to rev that up for no reason whatsoever? Or, do you just want to have it come naturally so that you can battle the battles that you ended up having? And I think sometimes that trade, again, I think you have to almost have, and maybe you were in that perfect position, having been a 12-year GM, having built the Falcons. It would have been the third time that you have built the Falcons from scratch, more or less. Not scratch, but you know what I'm saying, built them up from a lower place to a higher place. You would have probably been in as good of a position as anybody. One of the rumors that I do have on background that is almost substantiated was when the Vikings almost traded Mike Zimmer to the Cowboys. That would have been another one where Jerry Jones is sort of the de facto GM. He and his family are running the team. Mike Zimmer, a very good head coach, but there was going to be a clear bifurcation, a clear separation of church and state there. That could have worked. But I think for somebody who's early in their career as a general manager and a coach who's well established enough to warrant all those picks, it might cause friction that is not necessarily surmountable for the team.
No question about it. It's an ongoing discussion with the people who have talked about it, and people who have been in situations. Look, take Howie Roseman. Take Howie over his years and the different coaches he's been with different personalities. They worked and gelled for a couple of years, and then something went awry. And then, a guy they won the Super Bowl with, Doug Peterson, they split. He ends up down in Jayville, and he's doing some good work down there. As I understand, they really like him down there. And then, on the other side, here's Howie knowing exactly over the years, which is a very interesting point. The more you're around it, this is why I always sell to Arthur Blank, who I still have a really good relationship with. The people that have more experience in this league, they can talk about the mistakes they made as, in head coaching hires and the personalities they would look for differently moving forward. And I know that Howie has a really good understanding of what he wanted in the next head coach and how he approached Nick Sirianni. I mean, I love what they're doing together. Nick comes in, he has a great deal of respect for Howie because of his time, but he also is very strong with what he believes and how he respects that line. And they've been doing really good things. This coaching GM relationship goes on forever and ever, and I love it. It can be really, really heated, and it is at the core, it is such an important element to the owner getting it right in the very end. And we can go on and talk about this. I personally think that the league and the ownership, again, all due respect, I'm not proselytizing, but I do believe that whole idea of picking coaches and placing them and pairing them with the right GM is very, very important for your organization. And it can be really tumultuous if you don't get that right. Part of that process needs to be, I think, SumerSport related, needs to fold into a number of the mathematical elements that you would bring to the table if we were a part of, let's just say, a search group, right? How SumerSports and your background in the analytics side and my experiential background could pair together and truly present the idea of pairing together the right GM and coach, I think can be unbelievably beneficial to an organization.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's so many. We talked about on Monday this idea of rooting for your predictions, and I think there has to be And what I love so much about football is like it's a team game, right? Like you win or lose as a function of the same team. Like when it went down, when it went up in Atlanta, no one was saying, "Oh, this is a Dimitroff Super Bowl" or "This is a Quinn Super Bowl." It was a Falcon Super Bowl. When things went down, like ultimately it was both people, and no one cared. Like no one's going to care that like you were on this player and he was actually good, and the coach didn't want to play him, and so forth. Like it's all about it's all about the group, and I think that is where it has to be, right? Like if you hire two people and one's more high profile than the other, or vice versa, or they're both high profile, you have to have two people who are willing to root for things that weren't their idea. And that to me is just, it's so hard, right? It's so hard when you have, analytics love this player, but the scouts love this player, and the general manager weighed all the factors and went against my prediction. Like I can't be sitting there on a Sunday and saying like, "Oh, I hope he sucks," because if he sucks, your team's gonna suck, and that is a really hard thing to do, because we all I think this is why a lot of people gravitate towards sports betting. I think a lot of people gravitate towards like outside consultancy and all that kind of stuff, because it's just your prediction and it's very clean and it's very raw like that. But if you are going to work for teams, you are going to have to deal with the idea that you disagree, you commit, and now you root for the thing you didn't want. And and every single person has to be in that realm as well. And you can't just you can be right and wrong, right? Like I'm right about this player and I'm wrong because my team lost, because we took somebody else and I didn't back him up. And to our point last week about coaching, you could as a general manager draft a player the coach isn't comfortable with, and the coach could sabotage him and be right, but you're wrong because you're losing football games. And to me, like that's the biggest thing. And I think that's part of this. This is a great question, I think, by John. Is as a GM head coach, can you discuss the importance of bringing in my guys versus bringing other talented professionals, whether it be scouts, analytics, PR, comms, coaches, and more? Like, I think that, we see this in business all the time. Like, when I was at PFF, for example, it'd be like, hey, I want to go to bat to hire this person, and he or she better do well. And it's like, well, no, it's now that he or she's on our team, they're all of our investment. That it's all of us. But there is a little bit of that human element that creeps in about like that's your person, and that person needs to do well, or else it's your ass type of thing. And where that's where I think like sometimes it can get a little toxic.
Well, look, we talk about this all the time when a head coach is there and he's talking about the 3 or 4 people he must have on his staff. And quite interestingly enough, some of those coaches might have been with us on different staffs and it might not have gone that well. Think about that. Remember, everyone, when a head coach steps into your building, I don't know if I've mentioned this before. When a head coach steps into your building, he crosses that line the next day after he gets hired. We as management and ownership give that head coach full on say on who he wants on his staff. Even though he might not be the final say power person in the football department, rarely, if ever, in today's world does a GM have say on what the staff should be for the head coach. And that can have unbelievably positive repercussions or benefits, but it can also be deleterious to the success of your team if that head coach is only bringing his loyalists, and as a GM and your owner knows that it doesn't work. Think about that. But you just signed this head coach to a long-term deal, and there's no way you can tell the head coach, you're not signing these 3 people. This is another flawed element. I'm not saying that the GM should come in the good situations. Let me finish my thought. Not saying the GM should come in and trump. I am just saying that the GM needs to come in with the right background, I think right now, as we've talked about, the right analytics, supporting the coaches that the head coach is suggesting, or refuting it possibly, right, Eric? Where there can be really good discussion with the head coach and say, look, Dan, Mike Smith, whoever it is, it's your pick. However, please look at what we have here and let's compare a little bit before we make these final decisions, because this can be the end all be all, and it could be the positive or the negative for our organization. And it's a big talk.
100%. And I think the money dynamic absolutely plays into it. And in a world where the coach, generally speaking, will make more money than the general manager, then there's a power dynamic that comes into play. And it's absolutely why well, for one, I personally believe, and this might ruffle some feathers, I personally believe that we anchor too much on the superstar coach, right? Like I think that desperation yields poor decisions sometimes. And when you're so desperate to get the next hot head coach, you're willing to give him or her all of that, all of the resources they desire, and you don't necessarily check and see if that is good process. I think, for us at SumerSports with the, analytics and also your expertise and things like that, we could possibly avoid that, right? If a team knew that Coach A and Coach B, Coach A is the hot person on the market, but they're only 1% better than Coach B, would you really make sure that guy doesn't get on the next bus over Coach B? Probably not, right? But teams act like this: if we don't get so-and-so, the world's going to end. And if that's the case, the power dynamic is really difficult to overcome when it comes to things like assistant coaches and stuff. Go ahead.
Last thing here. This is a really interesting thing. When you get big power hitter owners as well, right? Those owners are not going to want to lose to their contemporaries in the street, right? Yeah. So if there's 3 or 4 teams bidding, I guarantee those owners are wanting who they think is best for their organization. All of a sudden, it's not just about the money.
Yeah, it's about a shoe size competition at that point, right?
Sure. And what I would say the last thing on that is, I was very fortunate to have Dan Quinn as a partner, because back to coaching very quickly, he would listen to me, and the good head coaches listen to their general managers, especially general managers who have been around for a while, who have interaction not only with those coaches potentially that will join the staff, but people that know them well, right? So a head coach who's open enough to listen to the entire, to whatever's presented, I think is a one that's going to make smart choices with the staff, which are ultimately going to benefit the team.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think this was a good example as a segue to, Jacksonville last season. They went with Urban Meyer, and he gave Urban Meyer quite a bit of leeway. I actually thought Urban did a decent job of hiring assistant coaches that had done something before. You had Brian Schottenheimer, you had Darrell Bevell, who had been coaches who had success. I thought they brought a professional element to it. It didn't work, right? And so they come back and they get Doug Peterson, a coach that has been around the block. He's won a Super Bowl. He played the game, right? He was he was the relief pitcher when Don Shula won his record-setting game for the Dolphins in 1993. He was, he's been around the block, right? Bring him in. Jaguars start the season 2-6. Now, when they were 2-6, they had a positive point differential. They reminded me kind of those later career Falcons, right? Where they caught, some bad luck, and, but it's turned around a little bit for them. And it's turned around in large part because Trevor Lawrence has become, now Trevor Lawrence, a guy that Doug Peterson didn't draft, right? So there could have been tension there. Now he's generational, I think, by all accounts. So, he kind of, it wasn't a similar situation, but now, you look at the last few games, and I know Pro Football Focus grades are not perfect, but you're looking at the last 6 games. He has a grade above 80, basically all but one game. The Detroit Lions, of course, because they're an absolute wagon, were able to hold Lawrence under his normal game. But this quarterback has grown into this position, and now the Jacksonville Jaguars, with Ryan Tannehill now probably out for the season, control their own destiny to win the AFC South. That's a hell of a turnaround, Thomas.
It's a hell of a turnaround. I love watching it. Kudos to Trent Baalke. Trent came in, as you know, a lot of people were throwing darts at him and didn't want him to survive, not only as a second-time GM, but because of certain things. And, he's really dialed in with Doug Peterson. When you think about Jacksonville, right, you think about what they're doing and their approach. And it's been interesting to watch. You also brought this up kind of off, and I think we're going in that direction as well. Can we talk a little bit about, finances and where they are and what may present itself? This is not an easy situation, right? This is something as team builders, head coach and general manager, you really have to think about on the other side of this. So I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons, so the Jaguars had a season win total of 6.5, much like Detroit. Back when I was at Pro Football Focus and I was doing when I was, and here's a former intern of mine, Arjun Menon, the vaunted Detroit Lions defense, the only defense able to hold down the Jacksonville Jaguars over the last month and a half. When I was looking at teams to bet over, I looked at the Jags, and the reason I looked at the Jags was, once you get, like, they came in and they gave Christian Kirk a big contract, a number 2 wide receiver. They gave him a $20-something million deal. They basically stopped every single wide receiver deal from proceeding for like 2 weeks, right? Because he just reset the market. They go and they get a guy you drafted, Foye Oluokun, out of Yale, a very useful linebacker for the Falcons. And they pair that with Cam Robinson, who they signed to a long-term deal at left tackle, Zay Jones at wide receiver. And all of this has turned. And this is, by the way, if people are looking to look at motivation for team, look at next year's salary cap for a lot of these teams. The Jaguars next year, they have 40 players under contract, and they are $4.4 million over the cap. So when I looked at that team going into the season, I said, look, this team has to try to win this year, because next year they're going to have to tear it down a little bit. And they can negotiate, they can move pieces around. But did that ever, I kind of want to take a step back for your experience and say, was that ever a situation that you thought of, like, look, we're pushing money to next year so we can win this year. We don't have as much commitment next year, so this year, we can look forward to next year a little bit more. Does that, because when I looked at the Jags, I said that team has to win this year a little bit, because there isn't necessarily an out for them to kind of move around and do things, for the future.
Look at that organization and Mr. Khan, of course, there were some direct and indirect pressures to, clean it up after the year before, right? They needed to win the fan base back. They invested a lot, to their credit, that they did it, and they did it with some good football players. They're now faced with a situation, as you just, alluded to, at least as a GM, a former GM, you would look at it and say, okay, we need to be a little bit more, or a lot more mindful of not bargain basement, but we need to be mindful about how we're going to approach free agency. And we know that. And by knowing that going into free agency, a lot of the personnel department now, like all the pro department, is really keeping their eye, I'm sure, for Jacksonville, on those players out there that they think can help them be at a good solid rate. And they're not going to waste their time. Not that they're not going to evaluate, because every pro department will evaluate all of the free agents that are coming available, but they are going to make sure that they parse those out and compartmentalize what truly they will have the money to play with and what they won't. And they will spend much more time as a staff focusing on those midline players than they will the great players. It's, again, not that they won't evaluate, but they know where they're going. We did that a number of times in Atlanta when we knew we just can't get into that market. And we would cut it off at a certain level. We would cut it off at what we projected the money to be, which is a big thing, right? When you have your pro department and your salary cap department working on the projections, you hope that you have some really solid projections so that you're in the right neighborhood, of course.
I want to talk about that in a different episode, because I feel like we could take a whole hour, because there's such like there's such a interesting problem, because, and we deal with this assumer with some of our products. There's the whole, what the market believes a player will be and what we believe a player will be. And because honestly, like if you have a high enough grade to pursue a player, you have to be able to divorce that from what the NFL at large views a player as, because you're not going to get a bargain buying players that the rest of the league likes too. So you kind of have, that's a multi-layered problem that's really interesting. But I do want to take just briefly, finish this up about the Jags, because I think the biggest part of this entire thing, and you can appreciate it having a quarterback in Matt Ryan who, early in his career was the guy, and was that guy for a decade. Ultimately, I think what the bet the Jaguars made was, we're going to put a ton of resources around Trevor Lawrence, and we're going to figure out whether or not he's the guy for this team. if he is the guy for this team, then we can cut some of those players and it's not going to matter, right? The same way Mahomes, with the Chiefs trade Tyreek Hill and the Chiefs are still first in yards, first in EPA, first in points scored, first in all this. And it's like you buy all the players to find out that the guy is the guy. And then you can start shedding the players once you realize he's the guy, because the great quarterbacks in the NFL are impervious, not to everything. We saw in the Super Bowl, if you take away 80% of Mahomes' line, it's going to be a rough outing. But they went 14-2 with 60% of that line injured, right? So you take it back to Jacksonville, you say, okay, we'll give you Zay Jones, we'll give you Christian Kirk, we'll give you Evan Ingram on a cheap deal, we'll give you an offensive line. By the way, both the tackles are hurt this week against the Jets tomorrow, so we'll see. We'll test that hypothesis. But we'll give you everything to make sure that you have the environment to grow and build. But once we find out that you're QB1, we have to start taking things away, because that's how the league works. And if you want that $50 million deal someday, that's going to be your reality anyway. And maybe that's how the Jaguars are thinking. And frankly, I can't blame them.
No, I don't think you can blame them at all. You're right on. You're spot on. And look, we could talk forever on the Jaguars and the quarterback situation. And I can't wait to talk about that from the financial standpoint that you mentioned a little bit earlier, because it is a full on episode for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about the other side. I briefly want to look at this year's class. So Desmond Ridder started last week for the Falcons. It wasn't pretty. They did keep that game close because of their run game with Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson. Brock Purdy is playing, obviously Mr. Irrelevant. His quarterback coach, my good friend Sage Rosenfels, that was an example, by the way, Thomas, of what you talked about Monday on the show, which is a college environment that is not necessarily conducive to growth at certain positions. Sage being an Iowa State grad himself, and I'm not dissing on Matt Campbell, but Sage was like, hey, I don't know if this offense is really a place where a guy can grow. Sage had a ton of experience with Kyle when he was with the Houston Texans. He said, look, I'm literally just going to coach up Brock Purdy to understand this boot action offense and gets him drafted, Mr. Irrelevant. And now he kind of looks like he's super comfortable. He looks better as a pro quarterback than he ever did as a college quarterback, which is crazy. Do you have Kenny Pickett, who's kind of had mixed reviews? And then now you're going to get Malik Willis starting for Tennessee. We talked about that on a previous show when he, was playing Kansas City. If you're a GM and you have one of these quarterbacks, I think obviously you just have to buckle up and try your best to build, around them. But if you're a general manager and you see this crop of quarterbacks and it's a pretty low probability that any of them are going to be a high level starter, are you looking at that and what kind of relief do you have when you have a great quarterback?
So you have a great relief, of course. Quarterback leads. We talked about that on and on. I'm going to quickly go back to Kyle Shanahan. This is quintessential Kyle Shanahan, right? Purdy, realize what his strengths are, know for sure what his weaknesses are. I don't know if you were alluding to the fact that Purdy had a pop gun arm. I'm not sure if you were saying that or not. We shouldn't be saying that. I'm just saying, what truly is, what does he offer? He offers intelligence. He offers management ability. And he's right in line with exactly what I think Kyle has done a marvelous job over his career with, right? The Brian Hoyers of the world, right? We could go on and on. I'd even say, a friend of mine who played for us with the Falcons, you sit there and think about Matt Schaub, right? There's another perfect example. Those guys, I just love when a head coach knows that he can get the most out of those guys. So they can still win, and they don't need, and they can compare it to the studs out there for sure. I'll jump back for a second and say, okay, well, you look at Ridder right now. I've already given Arthur Smith some major kudos. What are they? Are they fourth in offense right now? What they're doing with their run game is amazing. So yeah, it's not great right now with Desmond, and he's in his first game. What do you have? Below a 55 passer rating, and I don't know his exact stats, but he's got a long way to go, and they know that. They know he has a long way to go, but this is the time to work him, see where he is, because they have a very big decision coming up. Do they get aggressive in the draft and find another one that will compete with Ridder, or do they rely on Ridder for another year? I guarantee you, Mr. Blank is not sitting there with a ton of patience. he's going to be looking at that with a really keen eye as an owner, which owners do. So I find it fascinating. And let me just finish up with Kenny Pickett. I mean, what's he at? 1,700 yards. I mean, you have to give him his due. I mean, as a first rounder, I mean, I think he's not doing, he's doing a solid job, which is what you want, I think, as an organization, to see that there is benefit there. And your head isn't just going, oh my God, we need to snap a guy off the board next year or we are done. Omar Khan, first year as a GM, he's got an interesting situation for himself there, right? So.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Because if you're in that chair, right? And again, every time, it's so funny, like, to give the listeners a little bit of an idea of like our competitive nature. Whenever Baker Mayfield plays, Thomas makes sure to text me and talk to me about Baker's performance. And like, if that guy's a top 5 pick, it's a different story, right? With Pickett, you're talking about a top 20 pick, and you look and like that. And now Trubisky was running that offense the other day, but like you can see how that offense can be effective with a quarterback who's not necessarily elite, right? Because you have yak ability, you have running backs that can make plays, you have a defense on the other side that at its best can be a decent performing team, and that team's 6-8, which is not too bad in a really tough AFC. Ritter is in that category as well, where you've only used a 3rd round pick on him. You've only used a 3rd round pick on Willis as well in Tennessee. Like, you can build a big roster around him and make sure that he ends up being like competent. I think that the risk, though, and I want to bring this all the way back to the Eagles and Howie Roseman, the risk is what happens if you get the Jalen Hurts outcome, which is not only is he good, right, and good enough to build a roster around. There's no way the Eagles trade for A.J. Brown if Jalen Hurts doesn't show last year that he can drive the car, right?
That's right.
But I think my thought, and again, I think everybody's wrong about Jalen Hurts. If you think he sucks, you're wrong. And I think if you think he's worth $50 million a year, I think you're wrong. Like, it's a little bit in the between, but the NFL doesn't work in between, right? There aren't middle-class contracts for quarterbacks. Like, I think that the risk always with those guys that are good, but not sustainably so, in theory, is that there's always the risk that you end up with Jalen Hurts, which is, if Jalen Hurts plays Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl, can he win it? And if you take away some of the great things from Jalen Hurts because you increase his salary from less than $1 million to $40 million, can he be that guy? And that's what I think the risk is always when you give time of day ostensibly to the Ritters of the world and the Malik Willises of the world and even the Kenny Pickett's of the world.
Yeah, I don't know where you want me to go with that, but you had me mesmerized when I'm thinking about it. But yes, you're dialed in on it. So
yeah, it's just a crazy one. Lastly, I did say, we'll talk about Ravens a different episode because I know we're running short on time, and obviously you want to get to your family. I want to get to my family. Let's take some questions, and the first one's going to be a special one because this person is near and dear to our heart. One of our best friends and our colleague, Sean Clement, on Twitter at Sean from Seaback. Sean is actually in Seaback right now, in snowy Seaback, hanging out with his family. Would the league be better off without a trade deadline? Even allowing teams to trade players in the playoffs. Teams could go all in more easily and be more robust to injuries. Lower performing teams could extract huge concessions for highly sought players. Would this be unfair? Does that upset your sensibilities at all as a GM who, I don't know. I think in my mind, you fleeced the Patriots for Mohamed Sanu, for example. Would you have done that like in a later part of the season had that been available to you?
That's heresy to suggest that a former Patriot fleeced Bill Belichick, because it wasn't the intent, of course. Let me just say this first of all. Can I apologize to Sean Clement, our Black Hawk flyer in the military, because my alerts continue to go off, and he called me out on it the other day. I don't know if you've been hearing him. I want to apologize to our listeners. For some reason, I don't want to venture out to clean that up because it keeps dinging, and I apologize. That's just a little aside. Here, to the trade situation, brother, it would be mayhem. I would say when I look at that and I contemplate the idea of what Sean presented there, I'm thinking, man, that would, for someone like me who loved the gambling side of it all, not gambling, but trading and moving and being on the front end and not sitting on my hands, I would love that. I just think it would cause all kinds of ruckus within the NFL, and it's not what we're made up. How we're made up, and there would be a lot of staunch traditionalists who would fight that. It seems amazing. Yeah. Can you imagine down the stretch if you were doing that? If you had an injury?
Well, in the COVID year, Jared Valdir played for 2 playoff teams in the same, because you were able to go practice squad. So there was one time where Jared Valdir played for the Colts and then the Packers in January, and even that like offended my sensibilities a little bit. Like I think, and get me wrong, like as a mathematician, I view football as a game holistically, and I think I'm a capitalist. I mean, we all are, right? But like I do think that there are rules that make the game more fun. And I think the more that you take some of the rules away, as you said, there's mayhem and all that. And this gets back to kind of what you talked about last time when we were talking about, do you play out the string with a bad team or a team that's had some bad luck? And it's like, imagine you being like 7-9, right? And it's week 18 and somebody loses their left tackle. Imagine if you were like trade Jake Matthews to the Packers after Bakhtiari tears his knee up, and looking at Deion Jones and be like, well, you guys weren't good. Like, I just don't think that that's, whereas if you're not good enough to trade a player before the deadline, I think everybody's adults and everybody's like, okay, like we've hit the skids, or, there's our issues there. But I think doing it at the end of the year where you're just like I remember growing up, and he was stylistically, he and I were similar players. So like I was a fan of his, but I remember Brad Childress cut Marcus Robinson on Christmas Eve one year after they lost to the Packers and were out of the playoff race, basically saying like, Marcus, I hated you so much, but you were a good enough player for me to tolerate you while we were in the race. And then once we got out of the race, bleep you. And I thought that was like the worst message. And I think like in the last game, they played St. Louis in the last game at the Metrodome and got the shit kicked out of them. Pardon my French. And it was like that team quit on Childress for the last game because they cut one of the favorite players on the team after he was no longer useful to them. And I thought, like, I think you'd get a lot more of that, wouldn't you?
Well, you'd get a lot more of that. That's what I'd be most worried about, is how, the locker room stuff that we don't talk about that much when we're talking about analytics, because the math might say certain things. But those are things that I'm always thinking about. And I remember some of the discussions that I'd have with Mike Smith when he was, the head coach with me, as well as Dan Quinn. It was a big thing on their mind as head coaches, right? It might have been what was best for the organization, but they were worried about losing the team. Just bring it around very quickly. That is an overriding theme for head coaches. Even the best head coaches and the most confident head coaches do not want any element of the team not having their back, because that is the quickest way to fail. Of course, it's the quickest way when an owner finds out about that they really start, questioning the ability of the head coach.
Yeah. Let's take a question from by the way, I always say, it was a formidable time in my life. I was a college football player at the time. I keep bringing up Brad Childress. Brad took the Vikings to the NFC title game. He was one penalty away from going to the Super Bowl. He had a good tenure in Minnesota. I do remember the negatives more than the positives, but Brad, certainly wasn't a bad coach. I just always bring up the weird examples, but I don't want to be unfair to him. Here's Arjun again. Should the Bears be doing the same thing that the Jaguars did this past offseason in terms of upgrading the wide receiver room? And with the lack of talent, the free agent market, how should they approach it? This is a great question because, when they traded for Chase Claypool, that was part of the eval. Like, I got a message from somebody in the league saying, look, Ryan Poles is just trying to get an evaluation of Justin Fields. And right now you're seeing Justin Fields run around. They're a very effective offense from expected points, yards per play. But as a passer, he's leaving something to be desired, right? Like, he hasn't had a good PFF grade or a completion percentage or anything like that as a passer. And you see, like, it's not as supported in the data as you'd think, but running quarterbacks, there is always the risk of injury. Mm-hmm. What Arjun's saying is a good question because they give up a second for Claypool. The free agency market's not great. I think Juju Smith-Schuster might be the best guy out there this year. I do think the Bears should try to do what the Jaguars did as far as get offensive linemen into the building, get tight ends and wide receivers into the building, try to evaluate the quarterback because you got to make the 5th-year option decision after next year. But without available free agents, like, are you just trading mid-round picks for wide receivers that you know?
Yeah. Look, I want to just start by saying I'm a big believer in tight ends and how the tight end can really help an emerging quarterback. We did it with Tony Gonzalez, of course, with Matt Ryan. We made sure that we were smart how we let him evolve, and that was making sure that we took a page from Bill Polian's book and we surrounded him with as much as we could, again within reason, with receivers and tight ends. So I do think it's a really important part. I don't know the free agent market, to be honest with you, this year. All I do know is making sure that you have a good mix of versatile people in there are really going to be important, for Chicago and how they're going to evolve as an offense, and their quarterback is going to. So that is something that's strongly on my mind. Again, we said we're not going to talk about what the Ravens are doing, but their tight end, I love him, right? I think he's one of the very best. I love what he brings to the table, and I just think Andrews. I think you get someone like that. I don't know. What's your assessment of the Bears tight end situation? Because
they took Komet in round 2. I don't think he's been as good as they want him to be. This gets back to another discussion that I've had with my pal Sage, who, Sage Rosenfeld's, we've had discussions on his show about, if we ran a college football team, what would we do? And his thesis is run the Rams offense in college, because you can prepare people for, Rams, Shanahan, you can prepare people for positions that they're not going to play. Because think about this, Thomas, for a second. In the NIL and transfer portal era, which we are in, I saw this explicitly when I was in college. I was the tight end, but I was not, there was a guy that we brought in that was about my size, but he only played Division II with me because we would let him play wide receiver. Every Division I offer he had wanted him to move to tight end. And I think that's instructive, right? Because if you are a big-legged, big-boned wide receiver, but you want to play wide receiver, do you think you're going to go to Iowa and play tight end? No, you're going to go to a group of 5 team and ball out at wideout. If you, like me, and look, I wasn't that talented, but my first 2 years I played wide receiver, and again, I was a big-legged, big wide receiver, and they were like, Eric, you got to switch to tight end. We really like, and it was good for me because I got on the field. But if I was more talented, I would have just, especially nowadays where you could transfer laterally, you could have just transferred. So the hard part that I have is there aren't tight ends in the league. There aren't those players in the NFL, and the NFL compounds the problem by taking linemen and playing them in the run game as tight ends. It compounds the problem by, for that reason. But the hard part here is I just think there's a shortage of tight end athletes who are good enough to play that position at the NFL. And furthermore, it takes patience. I wrote this article at PFF a few months ago. A guy like David Njoku, you draft him young because he's really athletic and he's got everything going for him. It takes him 5 years to develop because you got to learn how to block. You got to learn all the offensive lineman stuff. And you have to learn how to play in the receiver position, but it's a different receiver position than college because those tight ends are not only more physical than what you're used to in college, but they're also more athletic than what you're used to in college. And so it's so hard to get tight ends in the building. And that's why, Thomas, Tony Gonzalez was so valuable to you, because you knew that he was good enough to do all those things. That's why Mercedes Lewis, a 2006 first-round draft pick, is still playing in the NFL, because at least the teams know that he can play that position at an adequate level. That's my problem with tight ends in the NFL, is that there's so much that has to go right for that guy to be a player. And it's also first-round picks bust out so quickly at that position that it's just really hard to do. I don't know. That's my rant on that. But I think that muddies the waters, because I agree with you. If you have a tight end who's good, it changes the complexion of your offense.
Changes the complexion. And the really good coaches now know that they can just isolate on. I mean, when you have a really athletic tight end, look, we can come back to the Falcons with Pitts. Unfortunately, he got hurt, of course. What he can do, and you isolate a safety, there are very few safeties that can move with him, right? That's to put a corner on him, which is not always that easy for other reasons. But yeah, look, it is a special position, and if you can get two of them, to me, I always thought that would be a really, really good thing. It's not always easy, right? What happens is, your tight end coach and your coordinator want that X and they want the Y, and the Y being the blocker, of course. And then you use up one of those positions, and you're putting the X and the Y out at the same time. And I always wanted to see two really good athletic guys with good, solid ability to block. They didn't have to be the kick-ass Y, but of course, there are some out there that do a good job with that, and others get creative with it. I think it's fascinating when you watch it.
Your 2016 Falcons, by the way, were when you ran 22 personnel, which for the listeners is two backs, two tight ends, one wideout. You were one of the most efficient offenses in NFL history out of that formation. And obviously with Austin Hooper, a guy you drafted. And did you draft Toilolo as well, or was he okay? Yeah.
By the way, Toilolo, I argued it forever with our coaches. I did all the what was our guy's name on ESPN who was doing all the science then. He'll be so upset if I don't remember his name, so I'm tipping my tongue. But I was saying, look, if you jump ball to Toilolo, there's no one. I was trying to to the head coach, trying to feed it to the coordinator. I was trying to feed it to Matt Ryan. I'm like, just jump ball to Toilolo. If you're 5 yards away from the end zone, there's no one. I don't care if the guy has a 45-inch vertical as a linebacker. So that's my rant on tight ends. I thought that along with Austin Hooper, like, look, I think you can do some pretty special things, but we'll see.
What especially that was Hooper still playing in the league, by the way, still productive with Tennessee. Really fun to see. So this has been a fun podcast. We went a little long, but we did get a lot of questions, and I thought that our discussion on head coaches and that was really fun, and I think food for thought for anybody in that chair or in just thinking about what it's like in the league. So this will be our last broadcast before Christmas. So for all of our listeners, we want to wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody there. Thomas, do you have any parting words?
No, just Merry Christmas to everyone. Again, thanks for hanging out. And it's been great growing with you guys in this podcast. So I'm so excited to work with Eric on it. And we have some really good ideas moving into the new year. Eric's always very creative with it. And I can't wait to be along for the ride, because I think we can impart some pretty interesting and probably different wisdom than maybe some of the other shows.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is what we're trying to provide, a unique perspective. And so if you are a listener and you want, we won't always read every single question, but we will try to challenge the bounds of what a football podcast is, because we know that there are lots of football podcasts. So we're trying to offer something different here. If you are listening to us on one of the podcast platforms, please subscribe, rate, review. If you're listening to us on YouTube, please smash the like button. And subscribe to the SumerSports Twitter account, the SumerSports YouTube account. That really does help us grow this network and grow, the great group. We'll eventually try to give our listeners a name, but I'm not quite sure if we're ready for that yet, Thomas. But I'm excited for that day. So like I said, happy holidays to everybody. Merry Christmas. And so for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 14 of the SumerSports Show.